Hello and welcome to the channel. As always, I'm your host Morgan. Today, I want to do something a little bit different for this channel. I have an article pulled up here on my laptop and I want to read through it and respond. Full disclosure, this is not a blind read through. I have read through it a couple of times this morning. I do have some notes written, and that is to help me keep my thoughts organized and allow me to most efficiently pull in my source material to back up my rebuttals to the claims made in this article. But before we dive into it, I do want to remind you that if you find any value here at all, please consider giving this video a like. If you want to see more of me and my content recommended to you, click that subscribe button and consider flirting with that little bell icon so you get notifications when I do upload future videos. And if you have thoughts to contribute to the conversation, please pop them down in the comment section below. I do genuinely enjoy reading and responding to the thoughtful comments on my videos when they come in. But without further ado, let's get into this. Before we really start reading this article, there are a couple of things that I do need to note. So I did find it while I was scrolling Ground News this morning, as I do most mornings. And the first thing we need to note is that this is a commentary piece. It's not a news article, so it is going to have opinions in it, and that is apparent pretty much from paragraph 1. It is also published in multiple places. We just happen to be reading it in this video from the Orange County Register. That is the publication that I've been able to access the full thing from without paying for a subscription. But there are like the little previews and snippets from the other places that I've seen, and it's all word for word. So I'm 90% certain it doesn't matter where you're reading this from. It's all going to be the same. So let's go ahead and get into this. The title is I Fled the Los Angeles Wildfires. Here's what would help prevent future tragedies. I'm someone who's very passionate about wildfire management and prevention and forestry, so when I saw this, I absolutely had to read it. I did notice after I clicked in that all the publications where this is published do tend to be pretty right-leaning as far as their bias goes, and as we get into this, it should be pretty obvious that this commentary piece is also leaning in that direction. However, I'm not using that bias as one of my points against this article. I'm actually going to respond to the points that they're making. I just want to note that now because I'm sure someone will make that connection here. I'm very open about the fact that I am a very left-wing individual, but the right-wing bias of this has very little to do with my rebuttals here. So let's go ahead and dive in. A year ago, Los Angeles was hit by two of the most destructive wildfires in California history, the Palisades Fire in Pacific Palisades and the Eaton Fire in Altadena, which forced me to evacuate my family's homes. The fires killed 31 people, destroyed more than 15,000 structures, and were made worse by institutional and policy failures. Sadly, 1 year later, these issues persist, leaving Los Angeles and other California communities vulnerable to future disasters. First of all, there are a lot of facts in that first paragraph, and again, sources are cited, so I appreciate that. However, we can see in at least the last sentence, the opinion is starting to come in. I don't want to get too ahead of myself at this point, so let's go ahead and continue reading, and we'll give my thoughts as we come up to the points where I need to address and rebut. The areas affected by the wildfires are located in the Wildland Urban Interface (WUI) areas, where human develop and wildlands intersect, leading to increased wildfire risk because of excessive vegetation. When California was being built up, Single-family zoning restrictions prevented the development of multifamily housing in the state's urban cores, where wildfire risk is lower. This created a drive until you qualify market that ultimately pushed urban sprawl into WUIs. We're going to go ahead and pause for a moment because, yeah, there are a lot of people, there's a lot of development into these areas that are more wildlands, and there is more vegetation there. There's a lot of reasons why vegetation is excessive. Not all of it is native. We do have a lot of invasive species like mustards and grasses that absolutely thrive here. And those species do catch fire very easily. But there's a few more points that I want to make before we really move on. So the thing is, fire risk and determining an area to be low risk versus high risk as far as fire risk goes is complicated. You can go to CAL FIRE to get an idea of the fire risk, but the reason why these urban areas are more low risk as far as fire goes has less to do with the vegetation and more to do with the response. So if you're in a city, you're in what's known as a local response area, or LRA. They're called local response areas because for emergency services, you have the local police, fire, medical, all of those are local and they're likely to get to you within minutes of your call for those emergency services. Whereas as you get to the outskirts, more rural areas, you start seeing the state response area, or SRA. And these are the areas where if you call 911, you need emergency help, it's going to be a state responsibility to get that emergency help to you. And you could be looking up to hours for that emergency help to get there. Now, that is a worst case scenario for that, but those are two of the things that really go into also determining how high a fire risk is in an area. To imply that it's just the vegetation here is disingenuous at best, because there are a lot of factors that go into determining fire risk. And of course, it's not just LRA versus SRA and vegetation, it also has to do with the climate of the area and things like that. Southern California here is going to have a very different fire risk than a similarly built up area in, say, North Carolina, where it's a lot more lush and green. There's a lot that goes into it, and I just feel this particular paragraph is worded in a way to make it seem more simple than it actually is. But let's go ahead and continue. I know that they did make a point about the zoning pushing people out, but put a pin in that because we're about to talk about insurance and we can expand upon that with the insurance. Insurance regulations in California, specifically Proposition 103, have also distorted organic incentives to live in safer areas. This proposition limits insurers' ability to raise their rates freely, even in light of inflation and increasing wildfire risk. As a result, California has insurance rates that underprice risk. We're going to pause again, and I know we're pausing after every paragraph at this point, but I want to make a note about Proposition 103 before we get into the nitty-gritty of a further point. Proposition 103 is a prop that passed in 1988 in California with the goal to protect consumers from, quote, arbitrary insurance rates and practices. So basically protecting consumers from these insurance agencies just hiking rates up as high as they want. This prop also established a regulatory system known as the prior approval system. And in this system, insurance companies can't just hike their rates without getting approval from the insurance commissioner. So there is a regulatory system that is meant to protect the consumers here. Let's move on. Research by the International Center for Law and Economics reveals that the state has the worst regulatory rate suppression in the nation. In other words, people in high wildfire risk areas often don't pay premiums that reflect the true risk of their location. Without insurance price controls or zoning restrictions by government, a functional market would emerge and encourage people to live in safer areas with lower insurance costs away from wildfire risks. Let's pause again. Are you surprised? You shouldn't be. They've made their full kind of point about this little section, and I have more thoughts that we need to talk about. So, they're implying that the whole reason that people live out in these more rural areas that do have higher fire risk is because of the insurance and the restrictions on the zoning as far as single family, multi-family homes go. And honestly, that is deceptive at best because urban areas in general are more expensive to live in than rural areas. There are plenty of people that tend to live out in more rural areas and then commute into the city to live because they're just priced out of the city. Rent, mortgage, all of that is so much more expensive. So it's not just about the zoning, it's not just about the insurance. And we also have a very high and continuously rising population in California. Our urban areas simply cannot accommodate all of the people living here. So urban expansion into these more higher fire risk areas is a given just because that's what the population demands. So again, implying that the single family zoning is the only thing that really has pushed people to move out of the city is deceptive. Yeah, I'm sure that historically that has had an impact, but today that's just where there's space available to build and live. And as far as insurance goes, at least with property insurance, and I know auto insurance and all of that other stuff, there are issues too, but in California in general, it's pretty hard to get. I don't talk about it a lot, but I am a homeowner, and every couple of years it feels like we're needing to find a new insurance company because the one that we've been with has decided to drop California because of the wildfire risk. I am absolutely certain that they do have a point. It probably has to do with the fact that these companies can't just raise their rates how they want because of the wildfires. They have to actually go through this rate approval process per Prop 103 that again was put into place to protect consumers. And the thing is, if these insurance companies are allowed to just kind of raise their rates however they want, it will price out average everyday families. We will no longer be able to afford to live in the state unless we're renting, basically. Because if you have a mortgage, there are certain insurances that you have to have. Let's go ahead and move on, but I'm sure we'll touch on this again at the very end when we wrap up. Given the inherent risks of WUIs in Los Angeles and other parts of California, it is vital to prioritize wildfire prevention. In such environments, one spark can ignite a devastating wildfire. Unfortunately, the circumstances surrounding the Palisades fire and the Eaton fire reveal that wildfire prevention has been neglected. This is a claim that I hear a lot, and I'm not surprised to see it in this article. However, I just want to kind of prep everyone reading this. They are going to try to make these very complicated things sound a lot more simple than they are. Now, the Palisades fire and Eaton fire do have two different potential starts to them, and we are going to talk about it. With the Eaton fire specifically, I'm going to have more to say. So let's go ahead and keep going, but wildfire prevention is not something that is neglected. It's just more complicated than people realize. The Palisades fire is thought to have been started by a rekindling of the earlier Lockman fire, which was started 6 days prior and was allegedly the result of malicious arson. Texts from firefighters reveal that the Los Angeles Fire Department failed to sufficiently monitor the Lockman fire burn scar, and that the firefighters were ordered to leave despite visible signs of smoldering terrain. Meanwhile, a leading hypothesis for the Eaton fire is that abandoned utility equipment owned by Southern California Edison re-energized and sparked the blaze. The transmission tower at the center of the controversy sat abandoned and unused for over 50 years. If those allegations are proven true, it means that both tragedies were preventable. In the future, LAFD should use thermal imaging to confirm that fires are completely extinguished before leaving a burn site. Utility companies should minimize the risk associated with transmission lines. At the very least, public safety power shutoffs should be implemented during red flag warnings, which was not the case throughout LA County a year ago. The companies should adopt fast trip technology, which can de-energize lines faster than they can fall and spark a fire. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about this, because they're making this seem like preventing wildfires is so easy, and it is not. I do work in forestry. Specifically, my career has allowed me to work in utility forestry, so I do have some unique knowledge here. I'm not saying that is the only reason you should be listening to me here. I'm going to be backing up my claims with source material as well, as I always do, but it does give me kind of a unique perspective here. And one of the things that really bothered me is how they implied that utility companies don't try to minimize risk associated with transmission lines. And I am here to say that utility companies do take risks associated with not only transmission lines, but distribution lines very seriously as well. And there are entire vegetation management programs devoted just to ensuring that clearance distances are kept and accidents don't happen. Of course, Eaton Fire is an example of an accident happening, because it's still humans going out and doing the work. Now, does that mean that the utility company should not be held accountable? No, it does not. Of course, they should be held accountable, because this is a mistake that caused a lot of tragic damage. It is something that realistically should not have happened. But one thing that people may not even realize is that there are California public resource codes that have to do with clearance distances when it comes to power lines. Again, not just the transmission lines, but also distribution lines. You can see here PRC 4293, which is specific to high fire risk areas, is showing you the legal clearances in which utility companies must maintain, which means they have to keep vegetation outside of these distances. And I can tell you that utility companies don't just stop at this legal distance. They do go in and usually take it out anywhere from a couple feet to a full double or even triple the legal distance, because you need to factor in a year's worth of growth, and there are regular routine patrols that go out and ensure that these clearance distances are met. Again, do accidents happen? Yes. Should the utility company be held fully accountable when these accidents happen? Also, yes, nobody is arguing that, but just implying that utility companies don't try to minimize the risk of wildfire is just, I'm going to say, disingenuous again, but it's also dangerous misinformation to be spreading, especially when people already have such negative views and relationships with utility companies in general. And their claim about there not being blackout events or public safety power shutoffs, is what they're also known as, is just not true. Um, because there were PSP events while these red flag conditions were going on. I know in Riverside County for sure, and I do know of them happening in LA County as well. Now, should they have perhaps called PSPS events sooner than they did? I would argue yes, but to say that there were not these PSPS events going on in January of 2025 is just blatantly false. So, yeah. As far as the LA Fire Department stuff goes, if it is true that the ground was still smoldering and they were told to leave, that is a big deal and that should never have happened. But I am not as confident about these claims being made as I could be to really sink my teeth into them. Because, yeah, if the ground was still smoldering from the previous fire and the firefighters left when it should have still been monitored further, they should also, they being the fire department, should also be held accountable for the Palisades fire in that case. Again, nobody's arguing that they shouldn't be, but the actual realistic ability to potentially use thermal imaging, I I don't know how realistic that actually is, or how expensive the technology would be to implement, or what would go into that. But it's just one of those things that, reading this opinion piece, it sounds like, yeah, that should happen and it would be so easy, but it's not that easy. And it is disingenuous and dangerous to be even implying that this should be easy. Moving on. Moreover, in 2020, the state of California and the U.S. Forest Service signed a memorandum of understanding that both parties would treat 500,000 acres of public land per year through controlled burns and mechanical thinning to mitigate wildfire risk. Neither party has fulfilled its pledge. In the 2024-2025 fiscal year, for example, CAL FIRE treated only about 180,000 acres. In the year prior, the U.S. Forest Service treated 325,000 acres. Both parties should honor their commitment, which would involve easing air and species regulations that often block urgently needed thinning projects. Let's pause again, because they're making it sound like treating this land is simple, but it does require a lot of manpower to do the mechanical and prescribed burn treatments. And especially when you're working with the prescribed or controlled burns, you can't just go start a fire willy-nilly. The conditions have to be absolutely perfect for you to be doing that, or you risk that controlled burn no longer being controlled and a wildfire happening. It's pretty clear to me that this person doesn't know a whole lot about wildfire management and has, despite clearly doing some research and gathering sources, gotten this idea that it's a lot more simple than it really is. And I know I keep saying that, but it is true. Managing wildfire, especially when it comes to making sure the ecosystem stays healthy and that people stay healthy, is complicated. And yeah, sure, easing air and species regulations would make the whole going in and treating the land a lot more quick, but these regulations help keep the environment and the ecosystem protected, as well as the people who live in and around these ecosystems and the environment. While, yeah, there was a commitment to treat 500,000 acres of public land per year, and that commitment has not been met, it doesn't mean that the regulations are the problem, because if you just go in and treat all that and collapse the ecosystem, you're going to have bigger problems down the line. And those bigger problems could actually involve an increase in wildfires as non-native species get a better foothold because they're able to choke out native species that are adapted to the fire. And even if native species do come back in and pop back up and either grow alongside or outcompete the non-native species, which is not likely, to put it um, quite honestly. Uh, we are seeing hotter, more intense fires thanks to climate change. Again, this is a very complicated issue with a lot of things that need to be considered by the experts in the field. Let's go ahead and read this last little conclusion paragraph, and I will get into my closing thoughts here. We must take decisive action in order for the Golden State to become more resilient against wildfires. Among other things, zoning must be abolished, Proposition 103 must be repealed, and all relevant parties, both public and private, must make wildfire prevention a top priority. Okay, so my kind of final thoughts here. The author, Kristian Fors, who I'm not familiar with despite the links and accolades listed at the end of this opinion piece, really seems to be minimizing the complex issue that is wildfire management. It looks like they did write something about the 2025 wildfires, and like I said, I'm not familiar with it. I'm not familiar with this individual, but based on this piece, they do come off as someone who does not have as well-rounded knowledge in the world of wildfire management and prevention as they would like readers to think, at least in my opinion. I do not think that abolishing zoning and repealing Prop 103 is the answer to the wildfire problems. Um, I'm sure there could be an argument for the single versus multi-family homes, but abolishing or repealing, Prop 103 would ultimately hurt the people living in California. Not necessarily those with the wealth and money to where it doesn't matter how much they're paying for their insurance, but the average people like myself who is very privileged to have been able to not be a renter, but I didn't do that on my own. I did that with my mother, and it it would not be possible if insurance companies were allowed to just raise their rates with no regulation. I live in a high wildfire risk area, or high fire risk is actually the more appropriate term, but that's just a nitpicky thing on my part. And this house is an older house. So I also, it is such a complicated thing that this author has tried to make seem so simple. Because again, people don't necessarily move to these more rural areas just because of zoning laws and stuff. They live here because it's less expensive. Because once you go into those urban centers, cost of living is just higher for everything. So if you're going to make it so these zoning rules are abolished and you get rid of Prop 103, you're necessarily going to have to address the cost of living, because that is the only way to not completely F over everyone living in the state who is not fortunate enough to be wealthy. But moving on to the claim that the relevant parties, in this case, I presume like the state, the federal government, the utilities, and the fire departments, are not taking wildfire prevention seriously or making it a top priority, is just dangerous misinformation. Because I know from my own professional experience that wildfire prevention is taken very seriously. And claims like these are just dangerous because it makes our job in the world of wildfire prevention and management so much more difficult when this is how the public is thinking. That's pretty much all I have for you today. I could probably keep going on and on about my thoughts about this article, but I would get a little rambly, and I have more or less summed up my thoughts and feelings about this opinion piece. It is still concerning to me to see something that is honestly so well written be put out into the world with so much misinformation, because that's what a lot of this is. And the fact that there are legitimate sources cited and facts that are legitimate facts peppered in there, it makes everything else said seem so much more correct. And this author does come off as an authority, especially to someone who doesn't work in the world of wildfire management and prevention, or who doesn't really have any knowledge there. And it is very disappointing to see something that, again, is very well written be allowed to be put out into the world in such a way where it is going to further skew the public perception of the world of wildfire prevention and management, because it is complicated. It is not easy. There are so many things that need to be considered. But at this point, I am going to take a moment to remind you to have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, what have you, and I will see you all in the next one.